So we're talking earlier about food. Talk about some other foods to avoid: processed sugar, excessive carbohydrates. What does that mean, excessive carbohydrates? Basically, it means you want to, a lot of people go keto, meaning they go very low or almost no carbohydrates. And I'm not opposed to a keto diet. I think some people find tremendous benefit from it, but I do think long-term, balance is a better strategy than imbalance. I think keto is the antidote to carbohydrate toxicity, which is what most Americans have, is carbohydrate toxicity, and keto is the opposite of that. But ultimately, we want balance. Like with many things, if this is carbs, this is fat, and this is protein, good balance is approximately 33% of each as a representation of your total calories in the course of your day. If you're doing something along this line, then you'll stay away from this right here. You will not be getting excessive carbohydrates. Now, part of that too also depends on the quality of that carbohydrate. Remember, some carbs are lower quality than others. Ultra-processed food, processed food carbohydrates aren't good for you. Sugar's not good for you. Breaking down all your fruits into massive bowls of juice or glasses of juice, that's not going to be super good for you. But if you eat a piece of fruit, if you eat a couple pieces of fruit even throughout the course of your day, that's not excessive carbohydrate. Of course, vegetables have carbohydrates in them as well. Those are good quality carbs. And then there are a lot of root vegetables that, a lot of people have found to be taboo, things like potatoes or sweet potatoes or yucca root or those types of things. But actually, there's some benefits to eating some of those types of vegetables as well. I think it's about quantity more than it is quantity of and quality of the food itself. So obviously, organic being better than something that's sprayed with pesticide, but avoiding excessive carbohydrate. One of the side effects of this right here is obviously it's going to be to elevate your blood sugar, your blood glucose. But another side effect is it's going to be elevation in your triglyceride levels. And so your triglycerides are something doctors oftentimes measure when you go to the doctor. They're measuring triglycerides. But what is triglyceride? This is fat in your blood. And a lot of doctors will tell you you're eating too much animal fat or eating too much fat. You need to lower your protein intake. And so what happens to people, unfortunately, is they reduce their protein intake and they substitute it for more carbohydrate, and their triglycerides keep going up because it was bad dietary advice. Most of the dietary advice given in mainstream medicine today is so antiquated, and it's based on pseudoscience at best. So beware of that type of guidance. You don't want excessive carbohydrate in your diet because this is one of the greatest risk factors for heart disease, cardiovascular disease, as well as diabetes and diabetic complications. So we want to control triglycerides, ideally somewhere under 75. Of course, we also want to control blood sugar, blood glucose. We talked about processed foods a little bit already. Not good for you. If it comes in a bag and you have to flip it over and you have to read 55 ingredients and half of them are chemicals you've never heard of or can't pronounce, that's not food. That's chemicals, that's preservatives. Those processed agents, many scientists believe, are obesogens, and they can affect your blood sugar. So try to avoid those types of ultra-processed and processed foods. This, packaged food kind of falls under the same guise because, all packaged food is processed, right? Not all processed food, or rather, all packaged food is processed food. And, again, this goes back to reading the ingredients. And if you have simple whole food ingredients, you'll be okay, even if it's in a package. But again, if you can't pronounce the terms, if you don't know what the words mean or what the words are, avoid it. So avoid these things. Let's talk a little bit about this study that came out. I want to point this out because this actually is a study on introduction to food. So you can see numerous dietary components have been linked to the development of islet autoimmunity. In this case, we're talking about controlling blood sugar, but in this case, in this study case, we're talking about type 1 diabetes. Now, a lot of people say, well, what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? Type 2 diabetes is predominantly people that have bad behavior akin to what we're talking about in this show, versus type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune destruction of the beta cells of the pancreas, the organ that helps you secrete insulin. And so you can see here again, so when we talk about development of islet autoimmunity, that's what we're referring to in type 1 diabetes, is damage of the pancreatic cells. So the study suggests that breastfeeding and late introduction of gluten, fruit, and cow's milk may reduce the risk of type 1 diabetes, whereas high childhood cow's milk intake may increase it. So I bring that up because these are foods that are classically in our culture, foods with gluten, whole grains, processed grains, dairy. What do most kids today eat for breakfast? It's cereal, right? So it's a mixture of grain with dairy. And we look at the obesity epidemic that we're facing right now, which again translates into blood sugar and diabetes problems. And so avoidance of these foods could reduce the risk of the development of type 1 diabetes. Now, again, I know this study is focusing on type 1 diabetes, but I would say to you that it doesn't just reduce the risk of the development of type 1 diabetes, it also reduces the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and so you should be considering that. And so those of you who haven't read No Grain, No Pain, or maybe you're struggling to get your weight off no matter what kind of diet you are trying, one of the reasons why that occurs is the foods that you eat are inflammatory for you. So when we talk about foods to avoid, these are the big obvious things, the super simple obvious things, but for a lot of people that list needs to include things like gluten and dairy. That list may also need to include other foods depending on the individual, because there's the old adage, one man's food is another man's poison. This is where sometimes if you're really struggling, it can be a smart idea to get tested for food hypersensitivity. And that way you can understand what foods would be best to avoid for you as a unique individual. Because if you're eating foods that for you cause inflammation, so one of the side effects to these guys is that they can increase the inflammation. And increased inflammation has an effect on our body by driving up cortisol. Cortisol has an effect on our body by driving up blood glucose, which then drives up insulin, in a big way. And fast forward this process, let's say you're eating inflammatory foods for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. This is accelerating. This process snowballs, and ultimately what it leads to is an absence of blood sugar control, because what happens is you develop insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance equates or leads to diabetes at the end of the day. So it's not always just the obvious sugar, right? If we look at kind of a lot of what the American Dietetic Association says, they really harp on processed sugar as a driving force here, but a lot of them also harp on meat as an agent of increasing risk for heart disease and other diseases. Of course, that's not true, but the excessive processed carbohydrates and sugars certainly are. So again, a lot of that mainstream guidance and advice is antiquated, outdated, and really flat out wrong.